participants, welcome to the 10th week of our discussions. In this current module, we would be discussing certain aspects related with television programs and films. In the previous module, we have discussed what are the major codes in the structuring of TV programs and also how we can understand the audience responses to them. Today, we would discuss the social effects of TV programs and TV images. We would later on develop this discussion to look at the economic aspects of these productions and their dependence on literature. The images of TV are a response to the contemporary society, and in a way, they are also subject to different forces. Their shapes and their formats and their choices are governed by socio-political factors, the religious organizations as well as labor organizations, etc. And therefore, they also move ahead to accommodate the newer changes in the social forces, and at the same time they also keep on making various allowance to contemporary socio-political climate. And that is why we find that even in literary adaptations, at a particular time, there would be certain understandings of contemporary ways of looking at a piece of literature which was written much earlier. During the late 1960s and 70s, the TV programs started to incorporate images of women which were progressive. They also incorporated colored people and made them significant stakeholders in all their programs from the point of view of the viewership. And despite the prevailing culture of sexism and racism, we find that the TV programs were trying to obtain a balance. There were also pressures from conservative groups to censor sexual and violent content to preserve the traditional value systems of family and religion. So, we find that the social significance of TV programs can be gauged from this brief discussion, which tells us that TV programs are a reflection of contemporary social forces, and at the same time they are able to accommodate various changes from time to time. TV programs therefore also reflect the inherent contradictions within a given society. There may of course be a lag between the actual experiences which a society is going through and its representation through the entertainment programs of the TV. At the same time, we find that certain dilutions may also occur. For example, TV programs may portray changes after dissipation of unrest and turmoil. They may also project a stereotyped version of a situation, and there may be a lack of understanding of complex and nuanced narratives, particularly of minorities, and it has continued to be a major issue worldwide. At the same time, we find that in most of the cases, when political and social changes and movements are being portrayed, the radical elements are minimized to a certain extent. There are also suggestions or attempts to assimilate and co-opt new values and attitudes within the status quo, but the radical changes are by and large avoided in the majority of the TV programs. Due to the massive heterogeneity of the TV programs, we find that as a medium, television has been able to record changes from time to time taking place within a society. The contradictions which exist between the actual individual experiences and the ones which are being portrayed in the television medium, owing to the differences between the encoding by the TV and the decoding by the audience, may also render television as a vehicle of culture, homogeneity and social control much less powerful than many people claim it to be. So, this idea suggests that the impact of television may be much less than people often presume it to be. At the same time, we find that the medium of television is often attacked by conservatives and neoconservatives. The profit motives are normally at odds with the traditional ideology, and therefore there are several complaints about the ill effect of television on traditional virtues and values. Neoconservatives also argue that television has eroded respect for authority by exposing political scandals, business corruptions, and failures, while fostering distrust, cynicism, and disrespect for the system. Media have also stretched the adversarial function to its limit, thus eroding the power of the state to govern properly. This idea, which is presented by Wildavsky and Moynihan, is reinforced by Huntington also when he says that TV promotes a democratic distemper. TV comes into a lot of criticism by the conservatives also on the basis of its having some type of a left wing bias. People think that it is a mouthpiece for radical changes, for example, ecological stop growth types, nuclear Luddites, and third world and socialist tyrannies. TV has also been attacked for being anti business, anti military, and anti traditional American views. If television has been attacked by the conservatives, we find that radicals also attack this medium. In their opinion, it is a tool to maintain the hegemony, and they often criticized this particular medium for promoting capitalist values and an advanced nature of consumerism. The conflicts between the radicals and conservatives indicate that the nature of social effects of television is at best incongruous. A television may produce different effects on different audiences. As we have already seen in previous discussions, it may have different impact on audience depending on their educational level, political biases, and the level of exposure. It may also happen that on the same individual, a TV program may have contradictory effects. But still, we can say that normally the TV programs reinforce pre existing values, ideas, and notions, as audience normally prefer to watch what appeals to them and what supports their ideology towards their own understanding of the world. A major aspect of television criticism is related with its universal appeal. Because of its universal appeal, we find that TV plays a major role in shaping our behavior, attitudes, personal preferences, and value system. But still, it would be a folly to consider it as being a monolithic tool of the ruling classes. Being a social medium, ultimately, it reflects conflicts and contradictions which exist within the society as well as within different classes and sections of the society. It would be pertinent to quote Elzensberg here, who says that the degree to which the power struggles within the ruling class are extroverted by Western television is without precedent in history. And he further says that all current theories of manipulation only serve to obscure this particular fact. When we look at the linkages between the television and literature, we find that various classics have continually been adapted into various TV programs because of their appeal to the masses and also because the adaptation is suitable for a continued program. There are certain novels which are continually being adapted. Louis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland is an interesting example of that. And at the same time, we find that the novels of Jane Austen have also been repeatedly translated into different formats, including the TV programs. I would particularly refer to Pride and Prejudice, which has been adapted into a TV program in 1958, in 1967, in 1980, and later on in 1995. At the same time, we find that the novels of Dickens have also been repeatedly adapted to TV program and they have been very popular. Arthur Conan Doyle's work, particularly Sherlock Holmes, has also been adapted several times. The adaptations of Sherlock Holmes started in 1951, and later on there were fresh attempts in 1954, in 1965, 67, 68, 84, and very recently in 2013. In all these contemporary adaptations, we find that there are minor and sometimes even major changes in the way a particular accident is explained, in the way a character development also takes place. Recently, we find that there has been an introduction of non white major characters in the story of Sherlock Holmes. Similarly, we find that Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Thackeray's Vanity Fair, and Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover have been very popular for adaptation. In addition to these classical works, we find that more contemporary work has also become popular as far as their TV adaptations are concerned. Michael Dobbs' House of Cards, Richard Morgan's Altered Carbon, an adaptation based on Neil Gaiman's works are very popular example. One of the most interesting example is based on G.R.R. Martin's book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, in a very popular TV program, Game of Thrones. Sometimes we find that the books which have been taken for adaptation are not even completed by the authors, but still, because of the pressures of TV adaptations, the writers are pushed into completing the work following a certain direction. If we look at the 1995 Pride and Prejudice adaptation produced by BBC, we find that it showcases how an old literary classical work can be adapted to incorporate recent critical changes and expectations of the audience. The 1995 adaptation is universally praised by both critics and audience. It was adapted by Andrew Davies and directed by Simon Langton. Though more or less it remains faithful to the source material, but still it is able to create a fresh, lively story about real people. And we find that, unlike Jane Austen, the emphasis in this adaptation is on money as well as on the sexuality as expressed by different characters in the novel. Some dialogues are also added to illuminate the background. However, most of Austen's original dialogues from the novel are retained. The focus has also shifted from Elizabeth only to the dynamics which exist between Elizabeth and Darcy. There is a greater narrative primacy to Darcy's role in helping the Bennet family in managing a major scandal after Lydia elopes with Wickham, and his role in the resolution of the novel's climax is also portrayed in much detail. Certain backstage scenes are also incorporated to provide a certain authenticity to characters. For example, the scenes which portray the dressing up of the women characters to advertise themselves in the marriage market are incorporated to appease the expectations of the current audience. At the same time, we find that some more additions are given, particularly the scenes where men pursue their own pleasures. It is a major shift from Austen's novel, where the focus is only on women and their own activities within the household or outside it. At the same time, we find that the incorporation of letter reading in a big way is also incorporated. We find that there is a use of flashback, voiceover, and characters are reading the letters which they have written to others, as well as the letters which have been written to them. A particular interesting example of the contemporaneity of this adaptation is the lake scene, which showcases the sexuality from a male's point of view, as well as the desire and sexuality from the point of view of a woman. In Colin Firth's Darcy, we find that this character Darcy emerges from a lake, which is a complete invention on the part of this particular adaptation. So Darcy emerges in a dripping wet shirt, and it makes a canonical classical text look more contemporary for its audience. This particular incorporation of this scene started a new wave of adaptations of period drama, and it is also responsible for making Austen's texts extremely popular. Whereas it has showcased Darcy's masculinity, we find that this particular scene also frames the sexuality inherent in the female gaze. So, radically, this adaptation has departed in embracing emotions in a modern reinterpretation of the story. It has also depicted Darcy's inability to express his turmoil, and towards the end, he ardently expresses his love for Elizabeth. So we find that the characters of Darcy and Elizabeth have been slightly presented in a different light, which is more suitable to the contemporary demands. And at the same time, certain characters are also comically exaggerated, particularly the characters of Mrs. Bennet, Miss Bingley, and Mr. Collins. The adaptation has expanded on Austen's metaphorical and symbolic use of landscapes and nature. Elizabeth's visit to Pemberley is particularly important from the perspective of this adaptation, where she realizes her love for Darcy for the first time. The significance of nature and environment is also given a more contemporary adaptation. Elizabeth's feistiness and rebelliousness is portrayed through her proximity to nature, which brings this adaptation closer to an eco critical understanding from the contemporary point of view. This particular adaptation is also important for the recreation of Victorian fashion sense. The costumes have been very well researched, and this research lends authenticity to this idea of the period drama. But at the same time, they also provide class based distinctions to the characters. The Bingley sisters wear costumes which are very elaborate, which are made in expensive material, and at the same time, their hairdo also suggests their rich social life. Another adaptation which is worth mentioning at this point is the adaptation of War and Peace, a historical period drama based on Leo Tolstoy's famous novel. It is a six-part adaptation by Andrew Davies, which is directed by Tom Harper. This adaptation expresses the quintessential storyline of Tolstoy's sprawling epic story in a condensed version. Because of the condensation, we find that the in depth character analysis is absent, but still we find that it retains the psychological insight, emotional richness, and to a certain extent, some complexity of the novel also. Critically, it has been acclaimed for being one of the finest costume dramas of the decade. Films are traditionally shot and projected on a cellulite, whereas TV dramas are also traditionally shot and they are transmitted on video. TV is often treated as a competitor of the film industry in terms of its popularity and technological development and the sudden richness in developments in related technologies. We find that the profits of cinema sometimes have gone down. Major film industries, including the industries in Hollywood, had to adapt. The studios had to either shut down or they had to invest in TV films and series over time to compensate for their losses in making films only. But let us say that these two mediums continue to respond to the demands for their own market share and for higher profits. The similarities exist despite the differences in the medium and the differences in the economic demands of the industries. Hollywood and BBC, which are representative of these two different genres, impose similar demands on their aesthetic projects despite the vastly differing economic models of these industries. In order to further understand this point, we should try to understand how the aspect of economy is treated and how this particular aspect of economy influences these two industries. The film industry and the television industry is characterized by the demands of the marketplace. In the film industry, we find that the box office gross earnings determine the revenue of producers, and further deduction of marketing cost and percentage for the render from gross rentals. In television industry, we find that there was a time, particularly in UK, when BBC had a monopoly. During the 1950s, the rival networks, which was financed basically by different advertisers, was set up. And very soon we find that a centralized control by a government appointed television authority was established, which was later known as a broadcasting authority. This broadcasting authority in UK decided the allocation of franchises for collection of advertisement revenue and production of programs for 6-year terms. It is also responsible for censorship of program broadcast on networks. On the other hand, we find that in the USA, the TV industry is more market oriented. It is more dependent on economy in providing audiences for advertisers, and advertisers are the markets of the TV industry. Even though we find that almost a similar phenomena exists in Britain, but in Britain it is relatively more controlled. In the USA, the annual license fees from viewers is used for providing network channels as well as choice of programs. So the degrees of involvement by national authorities differ in US and in UK. The economy of film and television industries can be understood by defining it into three different phases of development. In the first phase, sales of the products was important from an economic perspective, and films and programs which were produced in monopoly or in quasi monopoly markets. And there was a significant independence and aesthetic freedom for producers as well as for filmmakers. In the second phase of film and television economy, we find that a classical style and format was developed for films as well as for programs. This second phase is characterized by a development of oligopoly. Oligopoly is a state of limited competition, a state in which a market is shared by a small number of producers or sellers. Oligopolies can also result from various types of collusions and combinations which aim at reducing competition and which also simultaneously result in higher prices. Oligopolies are also price setters and they maximize the profit, benefiting from their interdependence and consequential perfect knowledge of various economic factors, which it is not possible for other individuals to possess. In the third phase, we find that the oligopoly is pressurized by external economic and political influences, and these outside and external influences had resulted from the demands to open up markets for new kind of products. So we find that in this third phase, oligopoly diversified itself by expanding into newer markets internationally or through means of investing in other media. It has led to modifications of products, a narrowing of product range also. So far, international film industry and British television have followed complementary product strategies, but the changing economic realities can easily turn them into direct rivals very soon. The internationalization of film and TV industries has also had certain impacts and consequences on national level industries. Hollywood's efforts to lessen resistance to its own sale in those countries which were developing their own industries is a pointer in this direction. However, we find that at the heart of internationalizing art, the question was always of revenue. And we find that because of this, the policies within Hollywood have also changed from time to time. In the 1930s, the majority of foreign artists and technicians in Hollywood came from Britain and Germany, countries which were struggling to build their respective industries. Movie majors started to employ artists and technicians from all over the world, and they also started to finance films at home in their countries as well as abroad if the scope for earning profits was there for them. On the other hand, we find that unlike the film industry, television has been able to more or less resist internationalism, and it has relied more on indigenous artists for its programs. Even though we find that the viewership is sold to other countries and continents, but the preparation and the finalization of the program normally does not incorporate international efforts. It also has certain impact on the subject matter. Though we have to admit that the parallels between film and television programs exist as far as the subject matter is concerned. But still, we have to understand that the motion picture industry emphasizes the need to produce films which are amenable to both domestic as well as international audience. So, the depiction of family life and sports in pictures needs revisions according to the market. And on the other hand, we find that in the television, the market is mainly local. It may later on may gain popularity in international market also, but the immediate demand consideration is linked with local or national issues only. It also has had a certain impact on British television particularly. In British television, we find that there has been a spurt in the production of family type program series which portray images of British history and culture in a way which would have a certain appeal to the foreign audience, especially in America. These type of series are normally set in fictional past, and they are centered on royalty or aristocracy or confidence of aristocracy, and at the same time we find that there would be a portrayal of those women who have somehow influenced British politics or have had a major role to play in British social developments. The romantic fiction is also set in the past, and therefore we find that the adaptation of literary pieces like Wuthering Heights and Rebecca is considered to be highly profitable. Interestingly, family dramas are co-sponsored by major corporations like Mobil, IBM, or McDonald's. And corporate sponsorship definitely comes with ideological baggage. For example, there may be endorsements of individualist enterprise, emphasis on stories of some great historical figures, emphasis on moments of royalist and capitalist milestones at the expense of others. British television drama has bolstered transatlantic connections between Britain and the USA, and there also has been a use of an ideological and political worldview to target female audience particularly. The British television has developed various series which emphasize the great and glorious achievements of their great past, the colonial past, and they work very hard to maintain the status quo. They also present a human portrait of authoritarian institutions and do not challenge or seriously question the legitimacy of authoritarian institutions. The struggles of class, capital, and labor are either cursorily dealt with or sometimes they are even ignored. Linguistic and political connections between Britain and United States have also prevented film and TV industries to unite in the name of national culture. The symbiotic relationship of Hollywood's mass culture and British television's high culture continues to be sponsored by corporations. BBC has diversified into satellite broadcasting, video cassettes, and cable, and particularly the US cable market is aided by BBC enterprises. In cultural terms, it leads to an increasing homogeneity of cultural products across market and different available media. However, the aim for both these industries is to generate as much profit as they can. Revenue generation for pictures is done by adopting different methods. One of the methods may be screening pictures in different countries, showing it to different kinds of media for a number of years, or exploiting lucrative markets like cinema and video markets. And later markets such as network TV can also be roped in. For big budget pictures, additional revenue can be generated through sales of license to produce franchisee products like toys, merchandise, t shirts, cups, and mugs, etc. If we look at certain approaches to film and television by critical authorities, we find that by and large there is a unanimity in suggesting that motion pictures and television shape our minds, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, and ideologies. Certain American critical studies can be pointed out which target practices of TV news programs and documentaries, which look at the impact of these shows, programs, and movies on students and young children. They also look at the popularity of historical docudramas, which have spurred criticism of the methods of educators. Despite these, we find that the scholars of film and television have encountered hostility from traditionalists in the academia. Defense of the word, that is, the literature, should expand the notion of literacy to include development of competence in both verbal and visual languages. There is a need for reading as well as studying the audiovisual forms of mass media. The study of film and television also require an interdisciplinary skill. Audiovisual narratives can be seen as metaphors and symbols as they reflect and constitute consciousness in a modern and in a postmodern society. And therefore, interrelationships which exist between and among aesthetic, intellectual, and institutional forces have to be looked at and scrutinized very carefully. Films are also a historical and cultural document. More than a record of visual reality, we find that they are also able to capture and tap into feelings and attitudes of certain times in which they are made. In a very interesting book, We Are in the Money, Depression America and its Films, published in 1971, Andrew Bergman has written that the classical films of the Depression era taught about the American dream, the magnanimity of the government, the role of the individual, lessons which placated the frustrations of citizens during times of unrest, turmoil, and difficulty. Critics have looked at the contribution of film in representing and showcasing the contemporary worldview. In comparison to films, we find that the power and role of television documentaries remains to be a matter of concern. In TV documentaries, we find that there is often a fabrication and distortion of materials and events, and even proponents of cinema are not averse to imaginative reconstruction of events. So, there is a need for critical review and assessment of most of the television documentaries. At the same time, we have to understand and admit the fact that institutional factors determine what ultimately reaches the public in the shape of news as well as in the shape of entertainment program. An examination of economic and institutional factors in determining the content and form of network programs remains to be highly pertinent. Another interesting aspect has been tapped by Richard Adler in his book What is Visual Literacy, published in 1978, in which he argues that in the age of electronic media, individuals require literacy in both verbal and visual languages to make a sense of the world in which they live. Even though television and film are very close to each other in terms of being artistic mediums, we find that there is a lot of debate about including the studies of television in academic film studies. It is interesting to refer to a work by Petris Petro, published in 1986, with the title of Mass Culture and the Feminine: The Place of Television in Film Studies, where he has talked about anxieties over the stress on audience survey, content analysis, and other staples of mainstream TV studies, which are normally not included in academic circles which study film making and film related works. The inclusion of TV into film studies raises the questions. For example, would these positivistic methodologies undermine the erudite methodologies of textuality and spectatorship, which are adapted from philosophy and literary theory to the field of film studies? At the same time, he says that the position of film studies itself is tenuous within academia. The inclusion of studies based on television may further destabilize it. He also points out to an inherent academic disregard for the empiricism of communication research as a threat to the status of films within the university. And he also says that the popular medium of television is often taken to be a vulgar culture related with the mass culture. Film studies in universities were associated with the pursuit of artistic and educational goals, and the incorporation of a vulgar and popular medium may further jeopardize the academic reputation of film study courses. The indictment of TV as a medium that encourages passive and discontinuous mode of reception is also there. For example, when somebody views a film, the person or the spectator focuses attention on the screen, and the spectator has a complete absorption in the narrative and characters. The use of the word viewing a film suggests it. On the other hand, when we say that we watch television, we find that this act is characterized by discontinuous attention. So, the supposed passivity and resultant association with femininity of TV spectatorship and reception in debates over the place of TV in film studies goes back to the differences between the high and low culture, the elite art and the mass culture. The problematics of using gendered metaphors to denounce or indict a form of culture or media are not new. For example, the word masculine is sometimes or rather very often used with production, activity, attention, and study of art. On the other hand, the femininity is related with consumption, of passivity, and distraction. The use of gender dichotomy does disservice to more nuanced historical and theoretically informed positions on the differences and similarities between TV and films, the different modes of production and reception that characterize them. So, we find that these two mediums are very close to each other. They are equally important for showcasing the changing moods and temperaments of a particular culture, but their reception within the academic fields remains to be different. Thank you.